So it seems that we've got a big core game update to Warhammer 40K on the horizon. Battleline units look like they're going to be more valuable than ever, and there's an interesting secret missions mechanic in a brand new and redesigned mission deck. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today Games Workshop have announced that a core Warhammer 40K game update is going to happen. Your standard match play games using mission cards are going to be redesigned in a month or so, all with a bit of a Pariah Nexus themed overhaul. This was something I talked about on the channel a couple of times already. It seems very likely that Games Workshop will be doing a new mission deck for Warhammer 40k for a number of reasons. Just judging by what they were doing over the latter half of 8th edition and throughout 9th edition, their normal way seemed to be to do a major update to the game rules at around about 1 year intervals, rewriting some of the core missions of the game and how games are played, and often taking some hints as to what was popular and what wasn't popular about previous sets, getting rid of some mechanics that were fairly universally unpopular, maybe making tweaks to the exact number of points that were scored for certain secondary objectives and things, or making more radical updates to the way that points could be scored and units interacted with things, which does genuinely have a big impact as to what sort of units are good or bad for certain armies. Previously that used to come in their chapter approved mission books that came out either once yearly or twice yearly. Though in 10th edition, from the start of the edition, it was clear that they were doing it in mission decks instead, so these decks of cards that have a small insert as to the rules to play a game in the front of them. And in general, that entire mission idea has been fairly popular. I did quite like it when it first came out. A bit of predictable scoring from fixed objectives, or the more random and kind of interesting dynamic tactical ones, meaning that you could go in with a very definite game plan, or be willing to have lots of units that can move around quickly and react to the missions drawn, potentially getting some very easy wins, but also drawing some cards that could be quite hard. The first one that came out with the Leviathan launch box was unsurprisingly called the Leviathan Mission Deck, though the fact that they named it as such really implied that there would be more coming out as well. They wouldn't really have needed to specify that it was Leviathan if it was going to be the only one, so at least to my mind, I thought we could expect a new one around about 1 year after the edition launch, and that does seem to be exactly what's happening. Apparently this new Pariah Nexus mission deck will be going up for sale in a few months. A little bit non-specific, but my guess would be that it might drop around the same time as the next balance update, whenever that might be. If they stick to their roughly quarterly intervals, I guess that could be towards the start of August or end of July perhaps. That would also fit well with being a year from when Leviathan came out. With its mission decks and core game updates, they often tend to try and theme it around one particular setting in Warhammer 40k. The first one was Leviathan and the onset of the Tyrannic War. This one is apparently Pariah Nexus, and I guess it's maybe a slightly late follow-on to the lore updates that we had in January, Admech versus Necrons fighting a great big war with super weapons within that blighted area of space, and the narrative ending with Vashtor turning up, corrupting some of those Blackstone beacons, and leaving the whole conflict on a bit of a cliffhanger. Games Workshop really did give us a fairly extensive preview as to what's going to be coming in this mission deck. We don't have all the details yet, and there's still a few things that will be really quite interesting to confirm one way or the other, but they've certainly gone through the main setup of the cards, how they're going to be arranged, and in particular the secret missions, and a few things to try and emphasise Battleline as being an even more important emphasis in lists. In the mission deck, there's apparently going to be 69 cards in total, and like the Leviathan mission deck, they should have a paper insert to say the core way in which missions are played, how you set up, how things are put in reserve, and some basics of how objectives are scored and things like that. That one's the main thing that they didn't really talk about too much in this preview, and any changes that happen there can be really quite big and alter the way that armies are made big time. It sounds like one of the changes that will be here will be some rules for doing actions, which are being reintroduced as a thing in the game. We don't know the exact rules details of those yet. There might be some sort of chance they stop OC0 units doing all the secondaries potentially. That's been something that's been speculated that they might do ever since 10th edition came out. Otherwise though, the core setup of the mission deck is basically the same as it was before, though the actual cards have changed, the standard mission rules and these secret missions being the biggest ones. You still have your standard way to randomize a game. You can draw a random deployment map that will work with any one of the primary missions, the basic way that you score most of the points in game, and then you get a mission rule on top of that to add a bit of a twist, maybe incentivizing taking objectives in certain ways or at certain points, or other weird and wonderful things to deal damage or stop units functioning in the same way as they would normally. A fair few of these mission rules now revolve around battle line units, generally giving armies that have heavy battle line unit use some big advantages. Otherwise, there's secondary missions and 2 decks of these, These have been rewritten quite a bit, though I'm sure they'll still have a fair few of the similar sort of ideas on some of the cards. There's still the option to go fixed or primary, and then gambits have been pretty much entirely reworked. They're rebranded as secret missions. The theme remains the same as a catch-up mechanic that you trigger at the end of the third battle round, but in all honesty these ones look a bit more credible, and it could be genuinely something that armies want to do a fair bit of the time, rather than basically a small chance of a slightly lost cause. I'd imagine the deployment cards are going to be fairly similar to how they were before, though it does seem that one of the biggest changes comes to the primary mission rules, where Games Workshop say that fully half of these cards will give some sort of advantage to battle line units in one way or another, either directly scoring victory points, being able to be used in different ways, or other things that could just generally help the army out a bit more than their opponents. In the current Leviathan deck, these were a bit more random, things like no deep striking on objectives, minefields to deal damage if you moved onto objectives, upping the command point cost to 2 CP for a command reroll, and a few others. It seems that this is going to be a bit more of a common theme to incentivize armies to take a few more basic troops, though it won't be applicable in every game. Some of them could have far more advantages for them than others. I guess that will generally be a positive for factions that just naturally take a lot of strong battle line units just in the armies that they want to field anyway, and maybe a little bit painful for armies that don't tend to have their battle line troops as the core of their army and more just have a few of them around for objective scoring and the like, as opposed to being the main event of an army. For these mission rules, they previewed 2 of them. The first one is the return of raised banners. This one's quite different to how it was before. It's not an action or anything like that, even if they are coming back. This one is basically a small bonus to your secondary score at the end of the turn. If you've got an objective that hasn't previously been scored in this way, then if you have the objective in your control and a battle line unit on it, then you raise a banner, and that objective scores you a one-time extra victory point. I say the difference there is small but meaningful. I guess in theory for missions with 6 objectives you could score up to 6 more victory points up to your total maximum of 40 victory points for secondary missions. Definitely nice to have in games that are close, and I feel like a lot of armies would just score that kind of naturally anyway. It's often the way that at the end of your turn you take midfield objectives by putting some high OC battle line units on them, and even if the opponent's about to wipe them out in return, you still get the extra victory point there. Overall seems nice enough, but hardly game breaking. Otherwise, the other one is Rapid Escalation. This one's an interesting option to allow you to arrive some battle line units turn 1 from Strategic Reserve. They have to set up anywhere within 6 inches of a board edge that is outside the enemy's deployment zone, and they do have a points cap for how many units can be set up in that way. It's 200 points at strike force, so I guess 10% of your points total. Means that in general you're not going to be doing an insurmountable alpha strike with loads of battle line units if you had some great shooting ones potentially, but I feel like that's often going to be an option that's well worth using. Just getting some more annoying troops into the mid-board early could be nice to threaten objectives or screen back the enemy potentially. Quite nice to get cheap screening units up the board that quickly. You couldn't use it for rapid ingress or anything like that, given that it specifies the reinforcement step of your movement phase. Again, seems handy enough. I feel like both of these are good incentives to have at least a couple of battle line units in your army, though I guess their importance is going to be vastly up or down mission to mission. As GW said, it sounds like not all of these mission rules will actually help battle line things, half of them won't, though it could mean that there's a bit more emphasis on them in general lists if they're going to be reliably helpful in a bunch of games. I feel like there's nothing wrong with incentivizing using a few more troops out there. It will just be kind of annoying for armies that have particularly weak troops, or troops that just can't really carry their entire army's damage and defense, and maybe easy times for certain armies that can, say for example Chaos Knight War Dog spam, which is nothing but battle line. Otherwise, for the actual main scoring of points, primary missions have been slightly redesigned. There's 6 previous ones from the old mission deck that haven't been messed around with too much, and 3 of them replaced with new ones. Hopefully they've decided to take out that Servo Skulls one, which tended to be kind of unpopular. As mentioned with this card, we can see that actions are officially back as a thing in Warhammer 40K. They were a thing in the core rules with their own rule set in 9th edition, but weirdly enough in 10th edition they decided not to bother with that rule section, and instead just sort of write pseudo-action type things on each individual secondary objective card that was relevant for them, basically stipulating that your unit can't shoot or charge or things while they're committed to deploying that teleport homer or investigating that signal or whatever. I'd guess that the core rule won't really deviate that from too much. It will be interesting to see what the core rules of that entail though. Again, certain units might be eligible or not eligible to do them, say OC0 units, and whether or not you have to declare them from the start of a phase or just any time in the phase The way that this one's written here sounds like you could shoot with a unit and then start doing the action after, as it doesn't say that it has to be declared at the start of the shooting phase, at least from this. In any case, I think that's kind of sensible to have it centrally defined rather than just reprinting the same basic kind of rules on lots of cards, handy enough to not have variations there. And I've previewed one where actions are relevant for a primary objective called Terraform, this one being a mission where you score 4 victory points per objective held at the end of your command phase as per normal, but then you can get an extra bonus 2 victory points for each objective marker that you've done a terraforming action on, that being a sort of defend objective type action declared in your shooting phase, and then it only completes at the end of the opponent's turn, so they've got the chance to either take the objective or destroy your unit. Feels like this one could be at least a fairly high scoring one, should be easy enough to hold your home objective and terraform it, so that'll be 6 victory points per turn. Then plus whatever objectives you can manage to take and hold in the midfield, it would kind of incentivize just making that you've taken and held one securely for one turn. So you can start off the terraforming on that, and then it doesn't look like you actually lose the terraforming benefit, even if your opponent takes that same objective marker. So once you've done the terraforming action, that's good for a couple of victory points per turn until the end of the battle. You can get up to 15 victory points per turn that way, so I guess it's more likely you might score more in later turns. Overall seems nice enough, a good mission that incentivizes pushing out to the objectives, holding them and defending them while your troops do some actions there. Next up, for the secondary missions, they didn't really give us too much of a clue about these. It does seem that there's still the same way to play them, either fixed objectives versus tactical missions. It was good that they managed to make both of them usable back in the Leviathan mission deck, which I think is kind of good not to have one of them obviously better than the other. From their free text description of them, they said that they've got better writing about how many points are scored with fixed versus tactical objectives, which I must admit was maybe a little bit confusingly written and needed to read through the entire card each time you did that. Looks like they've got a little grid formation with how many victory points are scored here, and that does look like it will be a bit more simple and more legible. Otherwise, they mentioned that there's new ones for booby trapping terrain features and securing board edges, so I guess we'll wait and see what those are. Otherwise, though, there's a return of a secondary called Marked for Death, maybe harking back to ones that we had previously. This one looks like it's a tactical objective, and when drawn, the opponent has to nominate 3 of their units that will be hard to kill. If the enemy can destroy any of them, then they gain 5 victory points. They'd also score them if your opponent tries to hide them away somehow, taking them off the battlefield and putting them into reserves or jumping into transports. At first impressions, this one looks like a pretty bad one to have in the early game. Likely your opponent will be able to hide a good number of their units, and it should be fairly simple to select 3 ones that you just can't kill. Usually you'd draw this at the start of your turn, so it's not like your opponent would need to move or expose them or anything like that, so you'd likely not score this the same turn, and then it might just be the decision whether or not you bin it off or keep it, depending on whether your opponent decides to move units up later. I guess it might be a bit easier to score later game if your opponent doesn't really have lots of units left, and they might have to nominate something that's a bit easier for you to kill. I suppose potentially keeping it on and not binning it off when you've likely failed to achieve it could annoy certain opponents, maybe having to make difficult decisions as to whether or not they expose their unit next turn, and stopping them from returning to reserves or putting units in transports. But that does mean that you're basically keeping on a secondary objective that is kind of in your opponent's control to prevent if they want to, and that really feels like it's going to be the best idea. Overall seems interesting enough, though I suppose it might be a bit more powerful at low point games versus high point games where there just aren't that many units on the table. Finally, and perhaps the biggest and most interesting change that they've got are 2 secret missions. This is basically Games Workshop turfing out the old Gambit rules and trying to rewrite them but better. I feel like Gambits were broadly a bit of a failed mechanic from the start of 10th edition. Games Workshop's attempt to write a catch-up mechanic that basically meant that if you were behind on the end of Battle Round 3, you could bin off your primary mission and go for an all-or-nothing Gambit that is broadly very unlikely to succeed. But if you do succeed in a Gambit, then you might win big time and get a whole bunch of victory points, maybe enough to just about swing the game if you're lucky. For me, they felt a bit random and very all or nothing. You're very unlikely to actually achieve a Gambit if your army was significantly behind, and even if you did and it flipped the result of the battle from a loss to a win, it maybe was just a little bit on the feels bad side. Particularly for the one where literally you just score the victory points if you could roll a high enough number. It was almost always a bad idea to try and use that as a pathway to win the games, but it could mean that you just arbitrarily had one player win over another who'd clearly outplayed them for the rest of the missions. and maybe just cheapened the whole result of the rest of the game a little bit. I still think they added a bit of fun factor, which definitely wasn't bad. It could give a losing player something to entertain them in the last few turns of a game, even if it was tending to be shooting for a bit of a pipe dream. But in my experience, a lot of people just tended not really to bother with them and just sort of forget they existed. With this new secret mission system, though, they have made some big changes, and broadly I think they've probably changed the mechanic for the better. This fully replaces gambits with a similar sort of idea. Basically, you can choose to trigger these at the end of Battle Round 3 if you choose to go for it, though you can only choose to do so if you've got fewer primary mission victory points compared with your opponents, or at least equal. I guess that helps prevent it from a runaway leading player from just going for this because it seems to be the best option for them somehow. So like the gambits, it's maybe not something to be relied on in every game. As the name implies, missions are kept hidden. This time you get to choose which one you have as well, so there's no random draw or anything like that. You simply take your secret mission cards, pick one of them, and I guess place it face down on the table or something. So basically you know which mission you've gone for, your opponent will know which options you had to choose from, but won't know exactly which mission they're trying to counter, which could maybe put them in a bit of an uncertain position. The secret missions generally keep the same sort of theme as they had before, essentially sacrificing a bunch of primary victory points for a big all or nothing victory point windfall. You either get 0 victory points if you don't achieve the secret mission, 20 victory points if you do, and this time round the way of stopping the primary missions is that you can now no longer score any more than 20 victory points from other primary missions throughout the game. So say if you'd scored 25 or something already, then your 5 victory points will be wasted. But say if you'd only scored 10 victory points on primary missions up to that point, you could still go on to try and score another 10 more, and in some situations you might genuinely not be sacrificing all that much. If say you had the 20 victory points already and you didn't think that you were likely to score another 20 over the next few turns, it could genuinely be not the worst option to go for a secret mission if there is one that you think that you could achieve. It's also completely separate from secondary objectives as well, so you could go on scoring those. Basically, the idea of these seems that they could be a possible choice if you don't think you'll score much on primary or even any more, but you still might do okay on secondaries. It could be worth going for a secret mission. Obviously, though, it's all kind of dependent on having one that you can achieve, and there's 4 to choose from, it would seem. From the ones that Games Workshop showed us, first up we have Command Insertion. This one's one where at the end of the battle, if your Warlord is in range of the objective marker in your opponent's deployment zone and you control that objective, you score 20 victory points, otherwise you don't. In some games I feel like this one might actually be surprisingly doable. Say if your opponent has just charged their massive army all the way up the board and taken the midfield and your home objective. Sometimes it's not impossible to flip their home primary objective from there to your control. It does depend on what your Warlord is and how they're going to go about that though. There may be certain sneaky ones might be able to do so, perhaps Gaunt's Ghosts from the Astra Militarum. That could perhaps make them an interesting Warlord choice to be able to go after the home objective super late game if everything else is going very badly. The next one is War of Attrition. This one means that you need to get one battle line unit partially within the enemy's deployment zone and either destroy all other enemy battle line units on the table or make sure that all battle line units are within their own deployment zone themselves. Again, depending on the army that you're fighting, this one does seem at least somewhat doable. Say for example if you're playing an army like Genestealer Cult where they can make some interesting redeployment things happen with their battle line units. It shouldn't be the hardest thing ever to get one of those to lurk in the enemy's deployment zone late game. And then it's just going to depend on how many battle line units your opponent has and where they are on the board. If they only had a bare minimum and you could focus the rest of your forces just to go hell for leather to destroy them. Again, this one does seem achievable even for an army that might be being dominated in the main damage game. I must admit it does feel a bit arbitrary that just literally having a battle line unit positioned just inside the enemy's deployment zone rather than just outside could be the flip of 20 victory points, particularly for a mission that you don't know that the enemy's selected. I guess this is one that you definitely need to think about if the opponent has gone for secondary missions and try and keep one battle line unit safe and out of your deployment zone. The next two I feel like might be ones that might be a little bit less likely to be picked, just because if you are destroying the enemy army or taking objectives this well, you might just be better off sticking with those primary missions in the first place. Shattered Cohesion either means that you need to destroy all enemy units, or make sure all enemy units are either battle shocked below half strength, or at least 3 inches away from objective markers. I feel like the only one of those that's truly within your control is reducing everything to below half strength, which isn't really going to be very easy to do unless that's happened a lot already. I guess if the opponent just has a couple more units that are above half strength, and some of the ones that don't look like they'll be pushing for objectives, then that could be alright. It does feel like if you're destroying the enemy army quite this well though, then just sticking with primary missions might be better. Finally, there's Unbroken Wall, which means that you control 3 or more objectives not in your deployment zone at the end of the battle. I guess this one will be one to go for if you're going second, though if you do have that much force to be able to take a whole bunch of midfield objectives at that point, then again you might be better off just sticking with primary objectives, as it seems hard to imagine that you can't score at least a little bit if you've got that sort of board control. Overall, I feel like those secondary missions are a bit of a shake-up, and I guess probably for the better given that gambits were pretty rarely used. They do feel like they're a bit more of a part of the core game as opposed to a very big arbitrary all or nothing. Compared with gambits, I could see some armies deciding to use them occasionally, even if they weren't enormously far behind, if they do think that they could do one of those objectives at least fairly reliably, unless the opponent can counter them and second guess what their intentions are. I could see this genuinely flipping some games from time to time. If you are in a position where you think that you're unlikely to score 20 more victory points from primary over the next few turns, and you think you can stop your opponent from blocking you and getting a big victory point payoff. Depending on the exact board, both Warlord on the home objective and the battle line in the enemy deployment zone both seem doable. Control 3 objectives at the end of the game probably seems the most easy to do, but again, I'd just be a bit questioning as to whether or not that's really going to outweigh just scoring some more primary objectives normally. I guess in some cases maybe it could if you can take them with a lot of fast moving but fragile units and you happen to go second. Having to think about the possibility encountering 4 different options could be pretty annoying for the opponent while they're trying to go about scoring their regular mission points as well. Could lead to some fairly hard decisions as to what they prioritise. I guess that could lead to a little bit of decision paralysis in a game that they're probably going to be slightly on top of. In any case though, I think they seem kind of fun, look forward to giving them a go, and I do have a feeling that we'll probably see these in play a bit more than we did Gambits last time round. Capping your victory points at 90 VP doesn't seem like the most killer thing in the world, and it sometimes feels like this might be genuinely the right choice, at least the opponent has a bit more counterplay this time round. In any case, some interesting developments for Warhammer 40k there. I'll be interested to hear your guys' thoughts on the new missions, promises of changes, and the new secret mission things. Do you reckon that these look like good changes on the face of it, or just some change for the sake of change? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones most days, and I'll aim to review these in full once they come out. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep these videos coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.